I'm here with some rats right now, but these aren't ordinary rats. These rats are specially trained to detect landmines because this country is still one of the most mined countries on this planet.
Everyone knows about the Vietnam War, about America's direct military intervention in the war, and about how tens of thousands of US soldiers died fighting the war in Vietnam that they lost. But even most Americans, I'd say almost all Americans, don't even know how the US military directly destroyed this country as well. Around 50 years ago, the US secretly and illegally carpet bombed this country that it wasn't at war with and killed hundreds of thousands of people directly in the process. But perhaps more importantly, this US intervention paved the path for the rise of one of the most brutal dictatorships in the history of the world that went on a genocidal campaign against its own people, wiping out a large part of the country for crimes such as being educated, for wearing glasses, or for even mourning for your loved ones that were killed by the regime. So in the span of just a decade, a third of the population of this country were killed because of all of this. This is the story of Cambodia and of what happens when an entire nation is trapped in one of the most brutal social experiments the world has ever seen, where no one is allowed to leave. To understand what really happened in Cambodia's recent history, it is also important to understand what happened in its ancient history. So for the next 5 minutes, I'm gonna discuss the origins of the nation of Cambodia to provide you with more context that explains what happened later. I am in Siem Reap right now, which is the second largest city in Cambodia with a population of something around 250,000. Although this is the second largest city, this really doesn't feel like a city in any of the neighboring countries of Thailand or Vietnam. Even at the center here, it feels like it's not that busy with just a couple of scooters and the occasional tuk-tuk and cars driving through. I got here yesterday morning after a very brutal journey from Sri Lanka with the overnight layover in Thailand, and I was actually sick before I even started that journey. So I got here yesterday and didn't film anything because I was sick. I'm still sick today, which you can probably hear in my voice, but I don't have all the time in the world, which is why I had to come out and start filming right now. Behind me, by the way, is the old market bridge there right in the city center. Modern human beings have lived in the area that is Cambodia today for more than 40,000 years, and there have been different empires that control the region. But in the year 802, this leader called Jayavarman II started the very famous Khmer Empire and declared himself the god king of this empire, or the Deva Raja in the local language. So the Khmer Empire went on to dominate this region for centuries, and at its peak around the 13th century, it controlled most of modern-day Southeast Asia, went up all the way till the south of China. And the capital of this empire during its peak was the city of Angkor. So this city, Angkor, was one of the largest and most complex cities that was ever constructed before the Industrial Revolution. And this city, Angkor, is actually only 6 kilometers to the north of where I am at Siem Reap. So let's head over there now. It's 6:30 a.m. the next day, and I'm actually inside the ancient city of Angkor. So the Angkor region was a massive urban system with reservoirs, canals, roads, hospitals, and administrative centers spread over hundreds of square kilometers. Satellite imagery actually shows that Angkor's elaborate water management network was the most extensive pre-industrial urban complex in the whole world. So the empire created huge reservoirs and canal networks to control monsoon floods and droughts, which allowed them to do year-round reliable rice farming on a scale that could support a very large population. So the engineering that we found here almost 1,000 years ago was way ahead of anything else that was found on this planet at this time. So right now I'm actually at Angkor Wat, which is a massive Buddhist temple complex, which is the largest religious temple or any religious complex in the world in terms of area. I slept for only 2 hours and woke up really early to head out at 4:30 a.m. Took a tuk-tuk here in the dark, got here completely in the dark to get the classic photo of Angkor Wat and the reflection of the temple complex on one of the ponds. It's very interesting that what you see on the internet, the beautiful photo that I'm going to show you here, versus the contrast in the number of people that were standing next to me to get that exact photo. But you know what? The crowd wasn't as bad as I expected based on some research I had done earlier on the internet.
So right now I'm gonna go inside the actual temple, which is a Buddhist temple now, but once used to be a Hindu temple, and try to see what it's like on the inside. So I just saw a monkey on the way in. Was not expecting monkeys in this complex. I guess there's monkeys everywhere in Southeast Asia. So I just spent like half an hour walking around just inside the temple. There's a really cool golden Buddha statue in the middle and a lot of beheaded statues, I guess, where the heads were stolen when the temple was pillaged throughout the years before it was being restored, of course. This reminds me a lot of Prambanan, where I went to in Yogyakarta way back in 2017 when I was starting off this channel. Although this is much bigger and much more complex than that. Angkor Wat, this temple, is so central actually to the identity of the Cambodians that it's actually on the flag of Cambodia. The temple is on the flag of Cambodia. And this is just one of the many magnificent complexes that you're gonna find in the ancient city of Angkor. So there's like the really cool Bayon temple, which has these really cool heads of statues. And there's also the Tomb Raider temple, for those of you who are as old as me who remember the Tomb Raider movie by Angelina Jolie. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover all of that for the scope of this video, so let's move on. The Khmer Empire declined due to a lot of internal reasons, and more powerful neighbors around the empire took advantage of this fact. So there was a rising kingdom to the west called the Siamese Kingdom, which covers much of modern-day Thailand, that took advantage of this weakening Khmer Empire, and they sacked the capital city of Angkor. So after being sacked by the Siamese Kingdom, the Khmer Empire were forced to move its capital from Angkor. And for a couple of hundred years, the court was kind of mobile and it was moving to a bunch of different locations. But finally in the 19th century, the capital was settled to be right here in Phnom Penh, right by the Mekong River, and it's remained the capital to this day and the largest city in the country with a population, or a metropolitan population, of well over 3 million people. So the flat areas of Cambodia became a frequent battleground between Siam to the west and Vietnam to the east. And stuck between these two powerful entities, the empire lost really all independence and power. And in 1863, the king of what was then Cambodia made a decision that would change the history of this country forever. Right now, I am in the complex of the Royal Palace in Phnom Penh, which was built in the 19th century right after this was officially chosen as the capital city of Cambodia. The king lived in this Royal Palace in front of me for many, many years, although the king doesn't live here anymore. Now, back to what I was saying earlier. In 1863, the king of Cambodia made a decision that changed the country's history forever. It voluntarily became a protectorate of France, losing a large part of its independence. But although they lost a lot of their independence as a protectorate, this decision might have saved them from disappearing altogether between the powerful entities of Siam and Vietnam on both sides. And then in the 1890s, France forcefully took over much more control of the state than it had before, turning it into a full colony from a protectorate. The king still retained his title, but had very limited powers or control of what was going on inside the country. And it stayed that way for many decades, till until World War II, Japan pretty much tried to take over all of Asia and came and occupied Cambodia. Now, at the end of World War II, when Japan was losing the war and France was also very weakened, Cambodia capitalized on that opportunity and declared independence for a brief moment. But that didn't last too long, and after World War II ended, France re-established control of the whole country. But then King Sihanouk, the king of Cambodia, led an extensive political campaign that eventually forced France to give Cambodia full sovereignty as an independent nation in 1953. And by the way, if you walk around town right now, you'll see a lot of influence on the architecture from the French. You'll even find a lot of people that speak French, a lot of people that have moved to France. It's because this was a French colony for so long. Right after Cambodia gained its independence, it found itself in a world that was in the middle of a Cold War between the capitalist Western powers and the communist USSR and the other communist states. And right next to Cambodia was the Vietnam Civil War that was unfolding between the North and the South, which was basically like a proxy war between these two powers. Now, officially, Cambodia tried to pursue a policy of neutrality, which on paper was accepted both by the Western powers, including the US, and by Vietnam, but in practice North Vietnamese forces were violating this neutrality. North Vietnam was using the Ho Chi Minh Trail that went through Cambodia and Laos to supply arms and resources to the Viet Cong, or the communist opposition to the Western-backed capitalist government that was controlling South Vietnam at the time. And Cambodia did not like that, but Cambodia's army was too weak to oppose North Vietnam at that point. While publicly insisting on neutrality and opposing any foreign intervention, King Sihanouk was privately signaling tolerance for US action against these North Vietnamese communist forces that were operating from inside Cambodia. Then finally in 1969, under President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, the US responded by launching a massive bombing campaign against these targets in Cambodia, which was initially kept very secret and focused only near the border of Vietnam. If you remember my video from Timor-Leste, Henry Kissinger was the same person who gave the Indonesian dictator Suharto the go-ahead to commit the genocide that was carried on in Timor-Leste using US-supplied weapons. He also supported the Pakistani forces in the Pakistan Civil War, where Bangladesh gained its independence, where the Pakistani forces also committed a genocide against the Bangladeshi people, my people. In 2000, the Bill Clinton administration finally released some classified info about the secret operations that were carried out in Cambodia. 2.7 million tons of bombs were dropped in Cambodia, which was a neutral country, and this was all done without congressional approval. This is all done illegally and secretly. To put it into perspective, the amount of bombs dropped in Cambodia by the US was more than all of the Allied forces dropped combined in World War II. And unsurprisingly, hundreds of thousands of people were killed due to this bombing campaign. Anthony Bourdain, the very famous travel chef and travel documentarian, had a very famous line to say about Kissinger's involvement in Cambodia. He said, quote, "Once you've been to Cambodia, you will never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands." The bombing expanded far beyond what Sihanouk had wanted, and it affected large parts of the countryside, not just the border parts next to Vietnam. And it turned the public sentiment against the administration. Now, simultaneously in the country, there was a growing middle class in Cambodia that was getting very frustrated with King Sihanouk's erratic policies and the amount of corruption that was in his administration. In 1970, a man named Lon Nol, an anti-communist general, led a coup overthrowing Prince Sihanouk and took power. There's no substantial evidence that the US directly backed this coup, but the US nonetheless was very happy that such an anti-communist figure that was willing to take a very hard line against the communist forces had taken over, because they felt like while King Sihanouk wasn't exactly involved with the communist forces, he was going too easy on them. So this coup triggered a full-scale civil war in Cambodia from 1970 to 1975 between the anti-communist general and his government forces and the communist forces. Initially, when the civil war started, the communist forces largely consisted of the North Vietnamese forces, which were the main enemy of Lon Nol. But over time, they were being replaced more and more by soldiers from the communist Khmer Rouge, that was the communist faction in Cambodia, who were still receiving heavy assistance from North Vietnam. Now, before the war, the Khmer Rouge had been a very small and a relatively weak faction, or a very small party. Historian Ben Kiernan from Yale has argued that the US bombing and the destabilization of Cambodia from 1965 to 1973 was a very crucial factor for the rise of Khmer Rouge. And it provided them with the propaganda and the recruitment opportunities by devastating the rural areas and by making the rural people more and more radical. Interestingly, the exiled King Sihanouk was very angered by the coup that removed him, aligned himself with the communist Khmer Rouge, who he had previously been essentially at war with. Now, this was also very important for the growth of the Khmer Rouge, because a lot of the peasantry in Cambodia didn't really understand the complicated concepts of capitalism and communism. These were like foreign terms that were just taught to them in recent years. But a lot of them still had a lot of loyalty to their king, King Sihanouk, who some of them still saw as the God King or the Deva Raja, as you remember from the start of the Khmer Empire. So this support that King Sihanouk offered to the Khmer Rouge helped them grow immensely. In 1973, the US finally completely pulled out of Vietnam and stopped bombing Cambodia. The Lon Nol government, the anti-communist government, was heavily backed by US money, US weapons, US air power. And when the US backed out, the Khmer Rouge was already controlling most of the Cambodian countryside, and they were still backed by the North Vietnamese communist government. So the anti-communist government forces were basically doomed at this point when the US pulled out. In 1975, Khmer Rouge finally won the civil war decisively, and they entered Phnom Penh, taking over the whole country of Cambodia. What's interesting is that King Sihanouk helped the Khmer Rouge win this war by supporting them and giving them legitimacy. But he was immediately betrayed by them. Once they had power, they discarded him as a political figure. They completely destroyed the monarchy. They put him under house arrest and went on to murder members of his family. King Sihanouk's political gamble had spectacularly backfired in his face. And Khmer Rouge, and only Khmer Rouge, was in control of Cambodia. In the middle of Phnom Penh is this compound called the Tuol Sleng compound, which once used to be a high school. But when the Khmer Rouge took over, this was turned into a prison, and the classrooms were turned into like prison cells, like the ones that you see right around me. And this was used as a torture chamber for enemies of the state, or anyone that was considered an enemy of the state at the time. It is estimated that over 14,000 people were imprisoned in this prison compound during the reign of the Khmer Rouge, and only a handful of them survived. So when the Khmer Rouge took over as the government of Cambodia, a man that went by the name of Pol Pot was their leader. And he led this country, Cambodia, into horrors like this that the world had never ever seen before. Like a lot of other communist regimes during the 20th century, Khmer Rouge sought to abolish all religion. They sought to abolish the concept of money and banking and private property. But they took it one step further. They were trying to abolish the concept of families, because they thought loyalty to one's family would compete with a subject's or a citizen's loyalty to the state. And they also realized that it would be easier to control people if you break up the families and break up the families. And it's just crazy. The year that the Khmer Rouge took over, 1975, Pol Pot started referring to that as Year Zero, or the year of the Great Reset. And he was trying to destroy the culture of the country that existed in Cambodia up until that year completely. He wanted to transform the country to a communist nation of peasants. Under the Khmer Rouge regime, people from urban areas were treated with suspicion because people from the cities had been the main backers of the government that was opposing the communist regime in the first place. Pol Pot ordered the evacuation of the entire city of Phnom Penh, which had over 2 million people. So, millions of people were literally evacuated at gunpoint. And during this evacuation, tens of thousands of people died from either exhaustion or some diseases, or were straight up executed during the evacuation because they were not doing things like they were told to be done. Pol Pot displaced all urban people to rural parts of the country and used them as slave labor in horrific conditions in an attempt to double the pre-revolutionary rice output of the country. So nearly all factories, schools and universities, and even hospitals in the country were shut down by the Khmer Rouge. And the nation kind of became like modern-day North Korea, where no one was allowed to leave the country. All citizens of the nation were required to wear standardized black clothing every single day. All knowledge of anything that happened before 1975, where Year Zero, was prohibited. And the nation tried to destroy all books that were even published before 1975. The Khmer Rouge was also very strongly against the educational system that was in place when they took power. So they systematically started killing teachers across the country, and eventually they started targeting anyone in the country that was educated. Even wearing eyeglasses was criminalized, as the Khmer Rouge took it as a sign that these are the people that might be using their glasses to read books that were published before Year Zero. And eventually, at one point, people were being killed for wearing glasses. As I mentioned before, the Khmer Rouge was against religion, so they started systematically massacring Buddhist monks. And at one point, they started killing anyone that was even practicing religion. The majority of Cambodia's historic architecture and 95% of Cambodia's Buddhist temples were completely destroyed during the era of the Khmer Rouge. But it gets even crazier. When someone was caught mourning for their loved ones who were killed by the regime, they were killed for the crime of mourning or showing love for their loved ones. There were even cases where people that were directly working for the Khmer Rouge or the Khmer Rouge loyalists, they were killed because they couldn't find enough counter-revolutionaries to execute themselves. So all the former businessmen and bureaucrats that were in Cambodia before the communists took over were hunted down and killed along with their entire families, as the Khmer Rouge feared that these people would be influential enough to create an opposition to the Khmer Rouge government. Unsurprisingly, because of all these horrific policies of killing anyone and everyone, it seems like, the economy of the country collapsed. And instead of doubling the rice output like they were planning on doing, there were severe food shortages in the whole country, where people started dying of starvation. In an attempt to execute all enemies of the state, the Khmer Rouge killed 1.4 million people in the few years that they controlled the country, which was a ridiculous 18% of the entire country's population. On top of that, famine, exhaustion from being overworked by the government, and diseases brought the total death toll to over 2 million people, or over 25% of the population of the whole country in 1975. So sources indicate that up to 60% of the people that died during the reign of Khmer Rouge were probably killed by executions, and more than 23,000 mass graves were found with the remains of a suspected 1.3 million victims of execution. So the S21 prison complex that we saw earlier is where people were tortured and detained, but that was not mainly where they were executed. The prisoners were often brought to places like the one I'm at right now, which are these empty fields and are called the killing fields. This one is exactly where people from that S21 complex were brought over, 17 kilometers south of the prison. Right now it is a memorial center for the genocide, but back then it was just fields where people were brought to be slaughtered like animals in trucks in the middle of the night, so they didn't know what was happening and they had less time to figure out what's happening. And in this particular killing field, this area, the Khmer Rouge killed over 20,000 people, and there were more than 300 of these killing fields spread across different parts of Cambodia. So I've been to concentration camps or execution camps that the Nazis used back during World War II, and the parallels here, like, so crazy. When they were killing people, they didn't want to let everyone know that so many people were being killed, so went out of the way to hide these horrible acts that they were doing. They had these generators here to provide electricity to these speakers that were basically during the day blaring like nationalist music and propaganda, and then at night they would still be blasting like music and propaganda, but the purpose of this music was to hide the screaming of the people that were being murdered with farm tools. You have to remember the Khmer Rouge did not have a lot of money, so they couldn't even pay for bullets. So they're literally like bludgeoning people to death with axes, pickaxes, and other farming tools. And once the people were killed, they were putting like insecticides on the bodies to try to kill off anyone that survived and to hide the smell of the rotting flesh so the people nearby don't realize what is happening. So there's a elevated walkway going through this area in the killing fields. It's because while this might look like a peaceful place today, you can still see some of the remains of the people that were killed here. Like sometimes the clothes, sometimes fractions of their bones pop up when it rains too much. So they created this elevated walkway to prevent visitors from directly making contact with the remains of the people that were buried here. Behind me is probably the most horrifying sight in this entire killing field. So when Pol Pot or the Khmer Rouge executed someone, they executed their entire families with them, so there was no one left to try to find or try to get revenge on the Khmer Rouge administration. And killing their entire families meant killing the women and the children as well. So the mass grave behind me, that's where the bodies of a lot of women were found, who from the evidence looks like were probably raped before they were killed. And this tree behind me, that's the most horrifying part. So you have to remember, they didn't have
or they were not using guns to kill children. This tree in particular was used to kill babies, sometimes in front of their mothers. They were literally bashed against this tree till they died and then dropped into graves. This is such a crazy place. So when people actually discovered this place, at first they were confused about why this tree was covered with bloodstains and why there were like fragments of bones on the tree bark. And then from the graves they realized what was going on, about the horrors that this place had seen. Really hard for me to imagine sometimes how people can be capable of such cruelty on such a massive scale. Behind me right now is the monument called the Independence Monument that was built in 1958 to celebrate Cambodia's independence from France, which is kind of ironic because even after getting independence from foreign powers, they got entrapped in this civil war that it's not even a part of in Vietnam, got affected by it, and then got trapped in a dictatorship by people from Cambodia. In 1978, the Khmer Rouge, that was already delusional with what it could achieve, decided it wanted to reclaim parts of the area that used to be part of the Khmer Empire but was now in Vietnam. And in December 1978, the Vietnam-Cambodia War broke out. And in 1979, 2 weeks after the war started, Vietnam decisively defeated the Khmer Rouge, and that was the end of the horrors of the administration that the Khmer Rouge directly were inflicting upon its people. But even after the Khmer Rouge left, an estimated 300,000 people starved to death in Cambodia as a direct aftermath of the mismanagement and policies of the Khmer Rouge between 1979 and 1980. Vietnam actually occupied Cambodia from 1979 to 1989, and they had their own like puppet government set up to rule the country of Cambodia because they wanted a government that was friendly to Vietnam and they wanted to eliminate the Khmer Rouge forever. Now, the Khmer Rouge wasn't exactly eliminated in that time. Pol Pot and a lot of the leaders actually escaped to the northern rural side of Cambodia and maintained an insurgency from there until around when the Cold War ended. The end of the Cold War finally gave Cambodia a real chance at peace, as all of a sudden the region didn't have to be the site of proxy wars between communist and capitalist greater forces. And in 1993, Cambodia had its first ever UN-backed democratic elections. And 90% of the people that were eligible to vote actually participated in the elections. But democracy unfortunately didn't last too long in this place. In 1997, a man named Hun Sen launched a military coup establishing a de facto one-party rule. He has then governed Cambodia in an increasingly authoritarian way for more than 2 decades until handing over power to his son, who became the prime minister in 2023 in elections that were widely considered by international observers to be rigged. In 1997, finally, leaders of the Khmer Rouge turned against Pol Pot and they had him arrested and they had him put through a show trial or fake trials where he was sentenced to life under house arrest for the rest of his life. And then in 1998, he finally died there in his house while he was under house arrest. Between the American bombings and the policies of the Khmer Rouge that followed as a direct result of Khmer Rouge coming to power because of the American intervention, you could say, 30% of the entire population of Cambodia were killed. There's very few examples in history where 30% of the country was killed in the span of a decade.
But unfortunately, in the case of Cambodia, the violence did not stop when the war ended in 1979. And the war was buried underneath the ground as the millions of tons of bomb that was dropped on the ground still remained there. So since 1979, since the war ended, over 60,000 people in Cambodia have been killed or injured by these landmines. And you can see a legacy of these bombs or landmines when you walk around day-to-day street. You can see the number of amputees on the street. I think Cambodia has one of the highest amputees per capita in the world. And just from my couple of days of being here, I have seen an absurd number of people with missing arms and limbs, which are for sure caused by these landmines or unexploded ordnances. So these landmines have severely slowed down the recovery of Cambodia over the last couple of decades by not only killing and injuring people directly, but in other ways as well. The landmines have prevented farming on otherwise what would have been very fertile land. And they've also blocked infrastructure projects from being built across the country because once again, you can't build highways on landmine affected areas without seriously and severely demining the area. And they've also kept rural communities poor by keeping them isolated as they're separated by areas that are very heavily landmined. So the problem with landmines in Cambodia is a pretty serious one. And this is where organizations like Apopo come in. This organization called Apopo trains these giant African pouch rats to detect landmines and unexploded bombs by using their smell. Now these rats are too light, so they don't actually trigger the landmines and make them go off. And they're able to clear large areas safely and really fast, faster than humans can do it with mine detectors. Just last year, the Apopo rats have cleared over 11 million square meters of land from landmines. And in their careers in the last 10 years, they've done a lot more. Right now in front of a Buddhist temple called the Wat Nam Down Pen, if I'm pronouncing that right. This is a very old temple and actually the highest religious structure in all of the capital city of Phnom Penh. You might have realized by now that after Khmer Rouge, religion actually made a comeback and people went back to their old religious ways once that crazy regime was gone. So from the 1990s until the start of COVID, Cambodia averaged an annual GDP percentage growth of 7%, making it one of the fastest growing economies in that time period. Also from 1998 to 2019, Cambodia's economy roughly quadrupled. And this growth was driven by garments, construction, foreign investment, and an increase in tourism. To put it into context, in the mid-90s, Cambodia was receiving roughly 200,000 tourists a year. In 2024, this country received 6.7 million tourists. And Angkor Wat and the Angkor architectural site has become one of the most visited sites in all of Southeast Asia. Even though the recent war-torn history of the country has left visible scars on Cambodia, which you can see in its missing population and in the politics that have followed since the war, the country is remarkably on the rebound. The country is rapidly developing, the living standards are getting better, and although it's not entirely get along peacefully with its neighbors because there's like a small war going on the west side with Thailand, it seems to have to manage to avoid major conflicts like the ones that destroyed this region. So we can only hope that future generations of this country have to never go again through the horrors that the people went through in the 70s and the 80s and the 60s even. Because when it comes to bloodshed and suffering, this country has seen more than its fair share. If you like this video, don't forget to like it. If you want to watch more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I am making more and more travel documentaries focused on the history of places these days. And if you want real-time travel updates, feel free to follow me on Instagram at Nadir on the go. Okay, I know this is not a vlog, but I just had the cutest interaction ever with these kids that saw me vlogging. They were on these electric bicycles and just sped off with it. Sped off with my camera because I let them hold it to film. And I'm out of breath. Whoa, whoa. Slow down. Hello. Hello. Bye-bye.
That was so
Akun.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I had to just include this in the video. Alright, that's actually it for this video. See you from the next one, Lao.